Back to this issue of amnesty and immigration. You know, a friend of mine, the Claremont Institute senior fellow and California State University professor Edward Erler, reflecting on Aristotle's observation, he wrote, this is important, listen to this, a radical change in the character of the citizens would be tantamount to a regime change just as surely as a revolution in its political principles. Got that? It's a revolution. It's a regime change. The government is not only justified but obligated to qualify immigration to those most likely to contribute to the well-being of the civil society and to create the conditions in which aliens of differing backgrounds can be absorbed into the American culture. Look what's going on in Europe today. Europe is dying. The whole concept of a nation-state in Europe is dying. In 1965, this is liberty and tyranny. In 1965, as part of the Great Society, the statists did in fact lay the foundation for radically altering the character of American society. This is what we're dealing with today, and the relationship of the governed to their government. The 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. Well, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act, have you ever heard of that? Hart-Celler, C-E-L-L-E-R. Celler was a member of the House. Hart was a member of the Senate. Two radicals. Johnson said the following: this bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add, importantly, to either our wealth or our power. And during the debate over the bill on the floor of the Senate, Senator Ted Kennedy said, quote, first, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains substantially the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the bill will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or area. And he went on. They lie today, they lied then, they lie all the time. Johnson and Kennedy and the other statists were wrong, and it's hard to believe that they were not intentionally deceiving the public. Now, in 1964, Republican vice presidential candidate Representative William Miller, he understood the overall increase in immigration that will result from the 1965 Act. He's the late father of the left-wing radical kook pseudo-radio host Stephanie Miller, if you can believe that. And he was Goldwater's running mate. He said, we estimate that if the president gets his way and the current immigration laws are repealed, the number of immigrants next year will increase threefold and in subsequent years will increase even more. How many more times, ladies and gentlemen, do we have to go through this? Whose interests are really being represented here? Every nation, including the nation of Mexico, has a right to secure its borders, and Mexico does when it comes to immigration into that country, as does every single nation in Central and South America. I'm not done. There's more history here that I think is worthwhile to put this in context. I'll be right back. 1965, the Hart-Celler Act pushed by Lyndon Johnson. So much damage. Now, that bill also introduced for the first time a system of chain migration. Chain migration for the first time, 1965. It didn't exist before that. And it gave higher preference to the relatives of American citizens and permanent resident aliens than to applicants with special job skills. So if an illegal alien comes into the country, and we've had many amnesties. People point to Reagan in 1986. That was the last one, but there have been many. We're living through one right now. Obama's issuing amnesty right now to millions of illegal aliens. Millions. So we have amnesty right now. And what they want is to cover more people with amnesty. So the historical basis for making immigration decisions was radically altered 49 years ago. The emphasis would no longer be on the preservation of American society and the consent of the governed. Now aliens themselves would decide who comes to the United States through family reunification. And with the elimination of national quotas and the imposition of chain migration, aliens immigrating to the U.S. were poorer, less educated, less skilled. than those who had preceded them, a pattern that continues to this day. So when people talk about, well, we've always been a nation of immigrants, every nation has always been a nation of immigrants. Every nation. But we have a completely different system in place today than we did before. Now, Theodore White, who was a liberal Democrat, who was an author, no conservative, he wrote, "The Immigration Act of 1965 changed all previous patterns, and in so doing probably changed the future of America. It was noble, it was revolutionary, and probably the most thoughtless of the many acts of the Great Society." You know who else had a problem with it, believe it or not? Arthur Schlesinger Jr., JFK's ghostwriter, close advisor. He wrote a book about it. In fact, in the 1960s, Cesar Chavez, one of the founders of the United Farm Workers, the UFW union, vehemently opposed illegal immigration. He argued that it undermined his efforts to unionize farm workers and improve working conditions and wages for American citizen workers. Cesar Chavez. And the UFW even reported illegal immigrants to the Immigration and Naturalization Service. In 1969, Chavez led a march accompanied by Ralph Abernathy, president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, close friend and confidant of the late Martin Luther King, president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Chavez led this march, Abernathy, and they were also accompanied by then Senator Walter Mondale. And they marched along the border with Mexico, protesting the farmers' use of illegal immigrants. Am I allowed to talk about this history, or is it taboo? In 2008, a Manhattan Institute study measuring immigrant assimilation in the United States found that the current level of assimilation of all recent immigrant groups is lower than at any time during the first Great Migration in the 20th century. No longer do we compel assimilation. In fact, we encourage balkanization. While some ethnic groups assimilated better than others, and for different reasons, Mexicans were the least assimilated overall and were assimilating at a slower rate. And they go on. That's not me, it's them writing this. Not me, it's them. Now, I've got so much on this, I can't possibly cover all of it, and I won't. But let me say this. For more than 2 centuries, individuals with diverse backgrounds have come together to form a national melting pot and a harmonious society sustained by allegiance to the country and its founding principles. But today's open-ended mass migration, coupled with the destructive influences of biculturalism, multiculturalism, bilingualism, multilingualism, dual citizenship, and affirmative action, have combined to form the building blocks of a different kind of society, where aliens, wherever they're from, are taught to hold tightly to their former customs, cultures, and languages. Balkanization grows, antagonism and conflict are aroused, and victimhood is claimed at perceived slights. If a nation does not show and teach respect for its own identity, principles, and institutions, that corrosive attitude is conveyed to the rest of the world, including the newly arriving aliens. And if this is unchecked, the nation will ultimately cease to exist. That is a fact. That is a fact. And so, I'm not going to go on and on about this. You can go to Liberty and Tyranny. I have a fairly long chapter on this entire issue, where I dig into the history and into the statistics and all the rest to deal with the platitudes that come out of the self-serving mouths of the likes of the chairman and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But I want you to understand something. If they get their way, you are the ones, through your school systems, your local hospitals, law enforcement, who are going to be subsidizing this. We are a nation with over $17 trillion in fiscal operating debt. We are a nation now over $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. We are a nation that is spiraling backwards as a result of this government and its policies. They are destroying our healthcare system. They are destroying our financial system. We have individuals who claim to be part of the conservative movement. How they can claim it, I guess they just assert it on their own. They certainly haven't demonstrated in any effective way. That none of this is really a big deal, that Edmund Burke would say, hey, calm down, everything's going to be fine, go with the flow, Don't challenge these new institutions and policies and programs and entitlements. No. Just adjust them. Just manage them better. Moderate them. That's the new conservatism. And then they put words in the mouth of one framer after another by taking them out of context to justify this. Does anybody honestly believe that Edmund Burke, who supported the American Revolution, would sit back and admire, for the most part, what's going on in the United States of America? Does anybody who's actually read Alexis de Tocqueville honestly believe that his observations in democracy in America, that he would sit back and say America's on the right path, embrace the status quo, it's inevitable anyway? Does anybody honestly believe that any of the men who attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia would sit back and say, this is the new modern conservatism? Just accept it. Oh, you can timidly adjust on the edges and here and there, or would they be appalled at what's been done to their Constitution, to the country, to the civil society? Does anybody honestly believe that any of the men who attended the state ratification conventions, one state after another, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Virginia, and on, that those men would have said, this is exactly what we intended? A living and breathing Constitution, lawlessness, overrunning the borders, centralized government, attacks on private property rights, affirmative action, you name it. Do you really believe that any single one of them would be endorsing what's going on in this country today? No, they wouldn't. None of them. Not one of them.